Well, welcome to the 2023 budget presentation. Modify my screen a little bit. Delighted that by doing this virtually, we have the opportunity to have, I think, 9 or 10 non-council members join us. So welcome to you. Tonight, I'm going to provide an overview of the budget that highlights the big issues and spotlights those line items that are either large or have had a significant change this year. John King will post the full budget to the chat so that anyone who does not have it already can gain access to it. Again, since I'm only going to be covering some of the line items, please take a look at the full budget because you may have questions about the things that I'm not highlighting, or chose not to highlight. Please hold your questions until the end so that we can at first ensure that I do get through my whole presentation. After that, we'll have some time for questions, which can be about the line items I've highlighted or any other aspect of the budget. Screen. Each year, I feel it's important to remind everyone that while the numbers are crunched by my finance staff and me, we don't operate in a vacuum. The Budget and Finance Committee plays a critical role in shaping the budget. Most importantly, they're the ones that made the cuts from the requested funding levels, not me. So I'm just going to highlight that to everybody. We began in September with the announcement of the budget process and solicitation of budget requests, resulting in a first draft of the budget in October. Beginning in November, we gathered fresher data, getting feedback from the Budget and Finance Committee, and developed a revised budget. In January, when we should have a clearer idea of our pledge income, we will likely amend it to the Budget Committee, then bring it to Council for approval, and then finally to Convention for a vote there. Now, let's get to the numbers. So this looks pretty good, doesn't it? We will have a balanced budget again. Unfortunately, it is something of a mirage, and there'll be more about that in a minute. You can see that our footings are increasing by almost $100,000. That's driven much more by unavoidable cost increases than by additional revenues. Reporting pledge income by year is a bit complicated because a significant amount of it comes in after the end of the year in the form of late payments and reconciliation payments after parochial reports have been filed. At the close of each year, we estimate both our uncollectible pledges and our likely receipts. To the extent that the final figures differ from that estimate, the difference becomes part of the following year's figures. For now, the committee is estimating that our 2023 pledge revenue will be about the same as this year. We will have to revisit that projection later this month after most of the pledges come in. I think so far we have about 9 or 10 in, and it's something of a mixed bag, but it's just, we don't have enough of them to have any real sense of where the trend is going to take us. In a week, I'll probably know a whole lot more. The reason that we're exceeding this year's budget by about $50,000 has to do with reconciliation payments from 2021. Many churches were conservative in late 2020 when they estimated their 2021 operating income, and we've collected more than $90,000 in net reconciliation payments. So that means basically we collected about 110 and we gave back about 20, or something like that for those who had overpaid. With luck, we will find out that the same was true in 2022. Going in the other direction, we always have some churches that are unable to fulfill their pledge or had lower revenues than predicted. So it effectively becomes a cut in their pledge. Here's a graphical look at our pledges over the last 23 years. We reached peak pledge income of $2.8 million in 2002. Then it decreased pretty significantly over the next 8 years to a low of $2,047,000 in 2010. In 2011, however, showed an end to that slide with pledge income of 2.1 million. And then we stayed in a very tight range between 2 and 2.1 all the way to 2019 before that cracked in 2020 with the onset of the pandemic. While we've recovered a little from our pandemic low, we may have established a new baseline for pledge income. And that's really the open question, is whether this V comes back up and gets us over that $2 million figure again or not. That's the real question here. And so that's going to be an issue. We just don't know. I mean, it might be an issue, it might not be an issue. We will see. The chart illustrates an aspect of the structural problem that we have, and I will come back to that later. We have two sources of income from the DIT. The first is investment income, which is the income distribution from the funds that have been set up to support the council. We had a significant shortfall this fall in investment income, but it has nothing to do with the market downturn. We had counted on income from the proceeds of a closed church right at the beginning of the year, but that fell through. Paradoxically, since the income distributions from the DIT endowments that support our budget are based on a 12-quarter average, the distributions will actually be going up next year by about 5%. The second source of income is fee income, which is 0.25% on most of the balances in the DIT, and that's charged quarterly and collected in arrears. So we immediately benefit from a rising market, and we feel the pain of a falling market, which is what happened this year, and basically why we have that $19,500 shortfall. We're budgeting it to stay flat next year, but if anyone knows what's actually going to happen, please speak to me after the presentation, because I'm very curious. We have two tenants at 31 Mulberry, the Victoria Foundation and Sadie Nash. We ended up with better than budgeted income this year because we effectively got a rent increase when Victoria's lease expired mid-year. However, they've now alerted us that they're going to be vacating the 5th floor at the end of next March, which will significantly reduce our income in the coming year. We are going to look and see if we can find another tenant, but we're somewhat limited in our ability to attract one because they would have to vacate the building at the time that we do. So you're really only talking about, a year and a half or so of availability before we sell the building to PAC. So the odds are we are not going to be able to collect any more rent in that space. We have asked for and are budgeting a rent increase from Sadie Nash, but that is still being negotiated. Ever since the budget shortfall relating to the 2008 downturn, the bishop's been voluntarily contributing some money from his or her discretionary fund to the council budget. 3 years ago, Bishop Hughes increased that amount by $60,000 to help pay for the new missioner for stewardship position. Over time, I'd like to reduce or eliminate this contribution since it really isn't appropriate. While I'd love to cut it further this year, I'm not sure that that's going to be possible. We are currently projecting a 2022 surplus of only $28,000, but we're nonetheless budgeting spending surplus funds of $132,000 next year. You might reasonably ask, how is that possible? The $132,000 reflects the full balance of all of the remaining accumulated surpluses from the last decade, which we wanted to use up before we start asking others for help in balancing this budget. So in many past years, we did not roll forward the entire surplus. And that was really for two reasons. One is we we often set the budget, we generally set the budget in October, November. We don't quite know what the budget surplus is going to be, and we're somewhat conservative. And so we set it at one level, and then we actually don't, the final surplus is not determined until really the end of January or so when we close the books on the final year. So very often we'd say we're gonna roll forward $75,000, but we'd end up with a $95,000 surplus or something like that. And those excesses built up over years to the point where we have basically an extra $100,000 or so in accumulated over those years. And so the Budget and Finance Committee asked that we basically empty out those funds this year, use all of them, and then before seeing what kind of a shortfall we'd have to go to the trustees for. So this will be, yeah. And this is going to be something that obviously is going to be a problem next year and other times. And this is a one-shot deal. And so when I was talking about the budget, being a balanced budget, being something of a mirage, that this is part of that reason right there. The Alleluia Fund is another significant income contributor. As you probably know, since the inception of the Alleluia Fund, the income has been funding a significant portion of outreach grants. We don't see any reason to expect it not to have similar success in 2023. The direct administration fees are reimbursements for service provided by council employees to the trustees. It includes the property manager's full compensation, as well as modest portions of other employees, such as my staff and me. As you can see, the numbers are pretty steady from year to year, but will jump a bit this year with compensation increases that we're requesting. For many years, the trustees contributed funds from the undesignated proceeds of sold churches to cover both the unfunded lay pension plan and the bishop search and call. Because the pension plan is now fully funded, and we've started an endowment for the bishop search, which we should have funded within a full few years, we aren't asking them to do that any longer. However, the committee can't see any way to balance this budget without their assistance. And if the pledges come in at a lower level than discussed earlier, we may have to ask for more than this. On the other hand, if God willing, they come in higher than that, we may not have to ask for this much. So this is effectively a placeholder at this point, and we will be alerting the trustees that we think we're going to have to ask for a number like this, but it's really wide open at this point. The projected salary budget incorporates a 5% raise for the staff. It does not make up for the inflation over the last year, but it attempts to balance what we would like to do with what we can afford to do. Interestingly, a poll of my counterparts from around the country found that the great majority were using this exact amount, although some went a little higher and some went a little lower. I mean, I'm guessing they all came in sort of one by one in emails, but I think there were probably, maybe 50 responses to a question somebody put out about what they're doing for raises. And I would say of those, more than 2/3 of them came in at 5%. It was very interesting. And so we are right in line with other dioceses in this. Obviously, others may, churches are facing the same issue with their staffs. And, it becomes often a question of how much money you have, not what you want to do. But this is what we would like to try to do. Our congregation and ministry development expenses were way over budget this year as our in-person programming returned to pre-COVID levels. The request is for only $9,000 for next year, but that may need to be revised before this budget becomes final. Well, I have to talk to the canons about this. This line item for Diocesan Convention covers the cost of convention that is not passed on to the participating churches. Costs were a bit over budget this year, despite the scaled down convention, because we wanted to limit the cost to $40 a person, meaning that we covered about half of the total cost. In 2023, we'll be back to a 2-day convention, but that doesn't have any real impact on this budget because it only represents about 15% of the total budget, and the balance will be covered by participants. The 3 commissions studying our racial history and proposing justice initiatives didn't require much funding in 2022, and nobody has a great sense of what they might need next year, so we're allocating $3,000 to them. The Youth Ministry Committee requested a jump to over $58,000 for their budget, inclusive of the $10,000 that we contribute to Crossroads Camp. The committee considered the request carefully and ultimately decided to trim it to $25,000, which still represents a near doubling of this year's spend. We will encourage the youth programming team to work with Cynthia on some targeted fundraising if they need more. I think that we can all agree that we want to do more in the way of youth programming, but that it's up against the reality of a very strained budget. Once again, we're contributing 100% of our national church ask. The 2023 contribution is based upon our 2021 operating income, so it is down a little bit from last year. Please note that that income figure includes the PPP grant to the diocese. It would have been much lower without that. For the last few years, we've been granting $70,000 directly from the budget, plus 100% of Alleluia Fund donations. We will grant more if the donors contribute more than $80,000. You might think that this slide indicates that we expect to spend less for General Convention in the future, but it actually reflects the fact that we have lots of money in reserve because the last convention cost $22,000 less than budgeted due to its shortened length and attendance limits. With the $39,000 reserve and 2 years of funding at $10,000 each year, basically for 2023 and 2024, we will have $59,000 available for the 2024 General Convention, which is in line or somewhat higher than we had in prior years. Administration is one of 3 areas that have seen significant cost savings due to working from home. While we have been able to bring some costs down permanently, and I should say working from home and remote meetings, we have seen an uptick in others as they revert to traditional levels. John requested quite a bit more than this, but the committee limited the increase to about 20% over current year expectations. Unfortunately, we must raise our B&G budget due to the cost of energy. Our 3-year natural gas contract expires in January, and we will be paying a much higher rate going forward. Other service costs have increased as well. So we have about 4 near-term challenges as I see it. The first, pledges may not materialize as budgeted. They may materialize better, but obviously this is a significant risk since, as I said, it does make up about 2/3 of our budget, and so just a 5% average decrease would be $100,000. So the numbers are big. It depends obviously much more on our big churches than on some of the smaller ones, and again, just too early to tell, and we'll find out in a few weeks how that goes. The second, we do need to get the cooperation of the trustees to help balance this budget, and likely next year's as well, as we transition out of our current space and as we try to continue to build the endowment for the support of the diocesan budget. Third, the budget, as mentioned earlier, the budget uses up our accumulated surplus, so that's not going to be available to use in the future. And fourth, if the financial markets don't recover next year, we will start to see a decline in our investment income. So that's where we kind of have a tipping point on the 12-quarter average balance that's used, of course, for our income and all the income that goes to the churches from trustee-held funds that support our congregations. And that is, we need to have a certain, probably about a 10% recovery in the markets just to keep that flat for in 2024, and we hopefully would do better than that, but that's a real risk. If they stayed at current levels through next year, we would actually see a decline coming in those. So those are the near-term challenges. We also have some longer-term challenges. Now, this is really only changed by one word in the last few years, but it is a critical word. I used to say that pledge income is relatively flat. We haven't bounced back to that 2 million to 2.1 million that we held for many years, and we may not. So now I say compensation is rising while pledge income is declining. Hopefully we can turn that around, but we'll see. Roughly 2/3 of our income comes from pledges. 2/3 of our expenses goes to compensation. The former is flat or falling. The latter was growing 2 to 3%, but it may have to grow faster with inflation going up. So is our funding model sustainable? The answer is still no. While the bishop has stressed and will undoubtedly continue to stress the importance of stewardship, both to the individuals that give to the church, and to the churches that both receive and provide, we need to think seriously about reducing our reliance on it. We took a big first step in that direction last year with the allocation of proceeds of sold churches going to a new endowment to support this budget, and that provided a bump to our investment income. But we're going to have to do a lot more. Perhaps a great deal more. Pre-COVID, I estimated the council needed an additional $6 million in endowment funds. I now think that we probably need at least $10 million, of which we already have 2.5, due to the drop in pledges that we've seen since 2019 or 2020. We'll have to look at multiple solutions, which would include expanded annual direct giving to the diocese, capital fundraising for new endowments, repurposing funds that we already have at our disposal but are perhaps not being put to best use, and of course the continuing the use of proceeds from sold churches to build up that endowment. So we're going to have to keep working on all of these issues over the next year because it's still clouds on the horizon there. And now what I'd like to do is I will stop sharing the screen and open it up for questions. John, if you can help me keep an eye out for anybody who's raised their hand.
Yeah, question, you can either raise your physical hand or use the hand raise feature.
Hello, I'd like to, St. James Upper Montclair, where is the, where are you going to move to the, you're moving out of Newark. Where's the church going?
No, we're moving out of our building. We don't know where we're going. It might be in Newark. It might not be in Newark. So we have a committee, a relocation committee that's working on that question now. But we have a year and 9 or 10 months to figure it out.
Sam, could you please describe the differences or the changes in what's happening to the proceeds of closed churches? I'm not aware of those.
Yeah, so that's not part of this budget discussion, but what happens is that goes to council and the trustees each time we have proceeds to distribute. And so with the recommendation of the bishop's office and active discussions, those funds are then allocated. Last year, what we did when we allocated them, or just over a year ago, what we stressed building up endowments. And so some trustee endowments for some of their expenses, as well as an endowment for the bishop search and some money to pay off or sort of pay the funding deficit that we had in our lay pension plan, and then to begin this endowment for the diocesan budget.
And is that
which got more than 50% of it, by the way,
sorry,
as opposed to funding new programs, for example.
So that's dealt with on a case-by-case church closure? Would that be correct?
Essentially, I mean, we grouped a couple of closures together, with 3 of them specifically. So we had money from 3 sold churches and a little bit of money that we were sort of tithed on a sale of some property. And we put it all together and proposed an allocation, which went to the 2 bodies for approval.
Thank you.
Excuse me, don't you think church closures are a problem? That we have a problem with church closures?
Susan,
Yeah.
Susan, if you could raise your hand when you're ready to speak.
I did. Did I
There
not
were
do
2
that?
other people whose hands.
I'm sorry.
were up,
I'm
so
sorry.
we're
I'm
gonna-
sorry.
we're gonna
I'm
call.
sorry. I
Thank you.
apologize.
That's okay. And then, John, I think you have a better idea of who was in line.
Bernie Milano had his hand up.
Thanks, John. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Bernie.
You made a comment about repurposing some of the endowments we have that are not perhaps being used either for their original purpose or are larger than what is needed for their stated purpose. Do you have any idea how much the aggregate of those funds would be?
So I guess first I'd say is nobody is actively working on that. So it is an idea that could be pursued. We have had significant growth in some of the funds. I'm not going to put out any. I mean, I think we don't have, we have almost no funds that are not being used. In other words, endowments where we are not spending the income already. And so any change that was made would almost certainly upset somebody. So it is something that could be pursued. I think in practical terms, it would be very difficult to do, but it would be for council to look at some of those and say, okay, do we have the right level of funding, or, in terms of priorities, is it more important that we get some more money coming into the overall budget rather than we give out the money through, a funding granting cycle, for example.
Well,
I think it would be very controversial, but I do think it's something that one has to think about, since we have, a very significant amount of money in endowments that support.
Yeah, I mean,
granting programs.
There's no easy answer, and people would be more upset if we have to cut programs or do something more drastic. So it might be good to put together a task force, whether it's the finance committee or it's council or some iteration of those groups to take a look at that and come up with a recommendation to you.
Yeah, and I think the chair of the, I should say the vice chair of council should take note here.
Yeah.
That I think it's, probably be appropriate thing for council to consider, and maybe, once we get past the granting work that's being done right now, that's something they could look at.
All right. Ann Kitch.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam, for your very cogent presentation.
You're welcome.
A couple of questions, just because I'm still, relatively new to the diocesan budget. So the surplus funds that you're talking about, are those being directed toward a specific area within the budget, or is that simply going to operating expenses?
No, it is simply going to operating expenses. It is, being plugged in there, put to use to help balance the budget.
And the buildings and grounds, what properties does that cover?
That really just covers Episcopal House.
Okay. So there aren't.
So the most of the expenses, the operating expenses for the bishop's house are in the bishop's expenses line item in the budget.
Okay.
The operating expenses for 31 Mulberry are in B&G.
Okay, thank you. And so I think you're, not that I should tell you that you're right when you're clearly the expert here, but in terms of following that rise in expenses under compensation and the decline in pledges, which is obviously church-wide and not just this diocese. Do you have a sense, and you may not, on the congregational level, whether that is our congregations pledges, is it just the dollar amount that's down, or are congregations also lowering their percentage?
Again, I have very few data points yet, but of the data points that have come in so far, in aggregate, we're probably about flat. And I would say, but flat is not, it's not that I have 10 of them and they're flat. In the last day, I had one that dropped 10,000 and two that went up most of 10,000. And we had previously had one that went down 8,000 or 9,000. So it's like those are the four big ones we've gotten so far, and they sort of cancel each other out. And what we're seeing both in the ones that went up and in the ones that are going down, they're not changing their percentage pledge. They're changing their estimated NOI.
Right. Well, that was my question. Is it because everyone's income is down, or is it?
Yeah, no. And so, so I'm just talking about this year versus last year.
Mm-hmm.
Last year, when people were making their pledges for 2022, we saw it was a mix of things. Generally speaking, NOI. NOI has been the problem, not pledge percentages. Mm-hmm. Overall. There's certainly some we could point to with the pledge percentages also dropping. When a church gets in really dire shape, absolutely the pledge percent gets dropped. But the more common one that we saw was most of our churches try really hard to hold the pledge percentage, but as they lost income from tenants or from nursery schools or that sort of thing, they tended to have just less operating income, which meant a lower dollar pledge at the end of the day.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Trying to see if there's any other hands up.
I think Susan, who I had.
Yeah, Susan,
before.
go ahead.
Yes.
You're muted, Susan.
Thank you, Bishop. First of all, is this going to be available? Because I'm the only one from St. James. It's on Upper Montclair. So I'd like to have, would like to have other people watch this. Is this going to be available? Yeah,
what we usually do, I think John has recorded this, correct, John?
Yes.
Saw the button. And so what usually we have Nina, our director of communications, can cut it down and turn it into a video on YouTube. Watch. And that we do that each year.
And thank you. Also, Sam, I have had our vestry look at your when you did that
the finances video,
the finances. And I've had that, and they have totally enjoyed it. I enjoyed your thing and did that. But I'm concerned about, so it was absolutely great. And what was great that we said to our vestry is we're already doing all that stuff. But it was very affirming for us at St. James. But I'm concerned about money from sold churches because we're concerned about churches closing.
Of course. We're all concerned about.
No, I understand, but to put that in our budget, I think
no.
Concerning.
Well, that's exactly what we're not doing. No, we're doing the exact opposite of that, Susan. So historically, a fair amount of money from closed churches was put into operating programs. What we are doing is putting it into endowments that produce income to support operating programs. And so with the philosophy that an asset will remain an asset and not get turned into an expense. And so that money, when it goes into the DIT, we then have a draw, 4.25% draw on it, and it can support our mission as a diocese till the end of time.
Okay.
So that's the current philosophy that we are trying to do. And we, as I say, we did with the $4 million that we allocated a year ago, and I hope we will keep doing. But of course, it's up to council and the trustees every time we have some money to disperse.
Okay. Thank you.
I hope that helps clarify things.
Thank you.
Peter Angelica, you're up next.
Thank you. And Sam, thank you for a wonderful presentation here on transparency on what's going on. I just had a quick question because you said, I think you were all giving a 5% raise to your staff.
Yes.
Could you tell me what raise you gave to them last year?
We did 3%. So we did 3% in 2022, and we had no raise at all. We had 0 in 2021. So the 3% last year was an attempt to try to catch up a little bit from having not raised it in 2020. And I'm maybe 5 now.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Bernie Milano, go ahead.
Yeah, Sam, I would have expected, I don't know if it would have affected 22 or 21, that because the churches had to pay their pledge percentage on the PPP loans they had forgiven, I would have expected that we would have had a substantial amount of excess or surplus for that year.
Well, if you remember, I did say that we had $90,000 in net reconciliation payments. Certainly a big contributor to that 90,000 was probably the PPP. We'd had a number of, I'll back up a little bit. So we have about, I would say effectively half of our churches, it might be a little less, it might be 40%, but somewhere between 40 to 50% of our churches basically take the view that theirs is a fixed pledge. So they're not pledging on a percent. They're saying we're going to contribute to the diocese $10,000 or $20,000 or $50,000 or whatever that number is. And so they're, whether they got a PPP loan or not has no impact on that number. So sort of take them out of the equation. Now, if we take the other half, or somewhat more than half, they do take it into account. We had a few of the churches basically said, we're not going to pay on the PPP loan. We think that's wrong. We disagree. They were quite vociferous about it, and basically said, we want to, we're going to use that money for some other purpose. We're going to put it in our endowment. We're going to pay ourselves back for having overdrawn the last few years, whatever it is. They just refused to do it. The great majority of them did agree to, when they got a reconciliation request, which included, of course, the PPP was in the NOI, they then, wrote us a check. And so it's a mixed bag, but that, absolutely had a big impact on the 90,000. I have not tried to quantify it. With a little bit of work, I probably could. My guess is that was probably good for, $40,000 or $50,000, but it's a bit hard to say.
Yeah, I wonder what it would have been if all the churches had done what they were supposed to do.
There were a few fairly lumpy ones. It wasn't the churches that got the $10,000 PPP grants that said no.
Right.
So
yeah, because they follow all the rules. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Please feel free to raise your hand. I don't see anything. I'm not seeing any hands.
If there are no other questions, then thank you, Sam, for your presentation, and thank you, guests, for joining us.